Justice. We imagine it as a fortress, a grand hall with marble columns and unshakable foundations, presided over by figures of unimpeachable integrity. But what happens when the cracks begin to show, not from the outside, but from within? What happens when the keeper of the law is a secret lawbreaker? And what if the person who knows the truth isn't a crusading lawyer, but the quiet, invisible man who hands him his files and fills his water glass? Tonight, we enter the hallowed, wood-paneled world of the judiciary, a world of gavels, robes, and absolute authority. But we will pull back the curtain to reveal a dark secret, a decades-old injustice, and a meticulously planned act of blackmail that exploded into brutal violence. This is the story of a respected judge, his trusted court clerk, and the murder that proved that the most dangerous secrets are the ones buried in plain sight. Before we open the docket on this shocking case, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We believe the truth is in the details, and you won't want to miss a single piece of evidence in the compelling stories we bring you each week. Now, all rise as we examine the final, fatal judgment of Judge Alistair Munro. The Honorable Judge Alistair Munro was a man of impeccable order. His life, like his courtroom, was a domain of rigid structure, unwavering logic, and absolute control. His suits were always perfectly pressed, his silver hair was always perfectly parted, and his judgments, handed down from the bench of the 12th District Court for over 30 years, were renowned for their intellectual clarity and unwavering adherence to the letter of the law. He was, in the eyes of the city's legal community, the very personification of judicial integrity, a marble statue of a man, unblemished and unmovable, which made the scene of his death a grotesque and violent blasphemy. He was found not in some dark alley or during a robbery at his stately home, but in the one place he was truly king, his own chambers. The room, usually a sanctuary of polished mahogany, the scent of old books and quiet contemplation, had been desecrated. Thick, leather-bound legal tomes were swept from the shelves, their pages splayed like the wings of fallen birds. A half-empty glass of scotch lay shattered on the rich Persian rug, its amber contents staining the intricate pattern. And behind his massive, ornate desk, Judge Alistair Munro was slumped in his high-backed leather chair, his head lolled to one side, his sightless eyes staring at the scales of justice statuette that sat on his mantelpiece. He had not died peacefully. His pristine white shirt was a canvas of crimson, a savage bloom of red originating from his chest. Embedded to the hilt, just below his sternum, was the instrument of his demise. A solid silver letter opener, a gift from the Bar Association a decade earlier, its ornate handle now slick with its owner's blood. The first to find him was his court clerk, Arthur Penn. It was Penn's panicked, choked call to the bailiff's office that shattered the morning's reverent quiet in the courthouse. By the time the police arrived, the news was already spreading through the building in horrified whispers, a contagion of disbelief. A judge, murdered, in his own chambers. It was unthinkable, an attack on the very heart of the system. Detective Frank Miller and his partner, Detective Sarah Jenkins, were assigned the case. It was a political hot potato of the highest order, and they both knew it. Miller was a veteran of the force, a man whose rumpled suit and weary demeanor concealed a sharp, cynical mind that had seen every flavor of human depravity. He had a particular distrust for the city's powerful elite, believing that their tailored suits and polite facades were just better camouflage for the same greed and violence he saw in the streets every day. Jenkins was his foil. Younger, sharper, a digital native who saw crime scenes as datasets and believed every secret left a digital footprint. They were met at the velvet rope cordon by a shaken but composed Arthur Penn. He was a man in his late 40s, of average height and build, with thinning brown hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a face that was utterly, almost aggressively unremarkable. He was the kind of man you could see every day and never remember. He wore the standard uniform of a court clerk, a slightly frayed gray suit, a white shirt, and a plain tie. His voice was soft, his hands were trembling slightly, but he recounted his discovery with a clarity and precision that impressed the detectives. "I arrived at 8:30 a.m., as I always do," Penn explained, his gaze fixed on the floor. The judge liked his morning docket review on his desk by 8:45 sharp. The door to his chambers was slightly ajar, which was unusual. He was a stickler for privacy. I knocked, and when there was no answer, I pushed the door open. And I saw him. "Did you touch anything?" Jenkins asked, her eyes already scanning the hallway, noting the positions of the security cameras. "No," Penn said immediately. "No, I backed out and called for the bailiff. I know the rules of a crime scene." Of course he did. He'd spent 20 years of his life in a building governed by rules. The chambers were a mess, but a strange kind of mess. It had the appearance of a violent struggle, of a robbery gone wrong, yet something felt off to Miller. The books on the floor, the overturned chair in the corner, it felt performative, like someone had created chaos rather than it occurring naturally. The initial theory from the courthouse security chief was straightforward. A disgruntled litigant, someone who had received a harsh sentence from the famously stern judge, had slipped past security and attacked him. It was a simple, clean narrative that everyone, especially the city's mayor, wanted to be true. But as Miller and Jenkins began their investigation, that simple narrative started to unravel. Jenkins immediately requested access to the courthouse's security footage and digital records. The head of IT, a nervous man named Peterson, showed her the system. "It's state-of-the-art," he boasted. "Every hallway, every entrance, is covered." But when Jenkins asked for the footage from the camera in the hallway directly outside the judge's chambers, Peterson's face went pale. That camera, it was offline. It was scheduled for routine maintenance this morning between 8 o'clock and 8:30 a.m. The work order was filed yesterday. "How convenient," Miller grumbled under his breath. Jenkins dug deeper. She looked at the judge's computer. It was on his screensaver, a slowly rotating image of the Supreme Court building. The last file he had accessed, according to the system's recent documents log, was a personal financial statement. But when she tried to open it, a message popped up, "File not found." "It's been deleted," Jenkins said, her fingers flying across the keyboard of her own laptop, which she had connected to the judge's hard drive. "And not just deleted. It's been wiped. Professionally. This wasn't a crackhead looking for a wallet, Frank. This was planned. The killer knew the maintenance schedule for the cameras, and he knew how to permanently erase a digital file. This was an inside job." Miller, meanwhile, was conducting interviews, getting a feel for the victim. He spoke to other judges, to prosecutors, to defense attorneys. The story was remarkably consistent. Judge Monroe was brilliant, fair, and utterly incorruptible. He was a man without scandal, without enemies except for the thousands of criminals he had sent to prison. Alastair was a monument, one senior judge told him, his voice thick with emotion. He was the moral center of this courthouse. He had no vices. He didn't gamble, he barely drank. His only passion was the law. The only person who offered a slightly different perspective was the judge's clerk, Arthur Penn. In a more formal interview later that day, Penn painted a picture not of a marble statue, but of a man. "He was a great man," Penn said, his voice quiet and steady. "But he was under a lot of stress lately. He seemed burdened, preoccupied. He was more short-tempered than usual. I assumed it was the pressure of the upcoming federal appointment. It was a well-known fact that Judge Monroe was on the shortlist for a lifetime appointment to the Federal Court of Appeals. It was to be the crowning achievement of his distinguished career. Did he ever mention any threats?" Miller asked. "Anyone he was worried about?" Penn shook his head. "No, nothing like that. He was a very private man. He kept a wall around himself. I was his clerk for 20 years, and in all that time, I don't think I ever learned a single truly personal thing about him. He was just the judge." The day wore on, a blur of forensics, interviews, and the quiet, heavy presence of death in the heart of the Temple of Justice. As evening fell, Miller and Jenkins sat in the judge's empty chambers, the chaos now meticulously tagged with evidence markers. "So what do we have?" Miller said, more to himself than to Jenkins. "A victim everyone says was a saint. A killer who knows the courthouse's security schedules and how to scrub a hard drive. No signs of forced entry. It has to be someone with an access card. Someone who belongs here. The file he was looking at before he died, Jenkins mused, staring at the blank computer screen. A personal financial statement. And Penn says he was stressed. What if the saint had a secret? What if someone found it? The call came just as they were packing up. It was the medical examiner. You're not going to believe this, Miller. The Emmy's voice crackled over the phone. The wound. Unusual. The killer didn't just stab him once. He stabbed him 7 times. In the exact same spot. He pulled the blade almost all the way out and thrust it back in over and over. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't a professional hit. This was a crime of pure, unadulterated rage. This was personal. Deeply personal. Miller hung up the phone, a cold realization dawning on him. They had a profound contradiction. A meticulously planned, technically sophisticated crime, executed with the wild, uncontrollable fury of a deeply personal vendetta. He looked around the room at the books, the desk, the chair. His gaze fell upon the clerk's small, empty workstation in the antechamber, its surface neat and tidy, a stark contrast to the violence within. Someone in this building hated the judge, Miller said softly. Hated him enough to stab him 7 times. But they were smart enough to make it look like something else. And maybe, Jenkins added, her eyes narrowing in thought, they were close enough that no one ever saw them as a threat. The investigation had turned. They were no longer looking for a monster who had broken into the fortress. They were looking for the monster who had lived inside it all along. And their eyes began to turn towards the quiet, helpful, and utterly unremarkable clerk who had been there for 20 years, watching, waiting, and hiding a secret of his own. The Emmy's report shifted the entire tectonic plate of the investigation. The image of a random, professional killer was replaced by a far more chilling one. A ghost, someone who walked the hallowed halls of the 12th District Courthouse with a heart full of rage, hidden behind a mask of normalcy. Detective Miller's gut instinct that this was an inside job now had the weight of forensic evidence behind it. The contradiction was the key. A killer with the cold calculation of a chess master and the frenzied passion of a scorned lover. Their focus narrowed to the people who had occupied Judge Monroe's immediate orbit. His bailiff, his secretary, and, most consistently, his court clerk of 2 decades, Arthur Penn. On the surface, Penn was the least likely suspect. He was meek, efficient, and by all accounts utterly devoted to the judge. He had no criminal record, no history of violence. His life was a flat, unbroken landscape of quiet, unremarkable service. But to Miller, that very lack of definition made him a perfect shadow. While Miller decided to work the human angle, Jenkins embarked on a deep-sea dive into the courthouse's digital and physical archives. She was hunting for the judge's secret, the what that would lead them to the who. Her first task was the seemingly impossible one of recovering the file that had been professionally wiped from the judge's computer. For 3 days, Jenkins sequestered herself in the department's digital forensics lab, a small, cold room humming with the sound of powerful servers. She ran complex data recovery algorithms, patiently sifting through the digital noise of the hard drive's unallocated space, looking for ghosts of deleted data. It was painstaking work, like piecing together a shattered vase from microscopic shards of dust. Meanwhile, Miller began a series of casual, off-the-record conversations with the courthouse old-timers, retired bailiffs, the semi-retired lawyers who remembered Alastair Monroe not as a judicial monument, but as a young, ambitious man. He was looking for a crack, however small, in the judge's marble facade. He found it in a dimly lit bar, talking to a retired defense attorney named Slick Morty Fine. Morty was a relic from another era, a man who had seen the courthouse's underbelly for 50 years. Alastair Monroe, a saint? Morty rasped, swirling the ice in his whiskey glass. Don't make me laugh, detective. He was a man like any other, ambitious as hell. He wanted that black robe more than anything. When he was a young judge just starting out, he was malleable, eager to please the right people. What kind of people? Miller asked, leaning in. The kind with deep pockets and long arms, Morty said with a cynical smile. There was a case maybe 25 years ago. It was a smudge on his otherwise perfect record. The Thorn case. Kid named Marcus Thorn, rich as Croesus, son of a construction magnate. Drunk driving, smashed his sports car into another vehicle. Killed a young woman. It was an open-and-shut case of vehicular manslaughter. He should have done 10 years easy. What happened? Monroe was the judge, Morty said, his eyes distant with the memory. The pressure on him was immense. Old Man Thorne practically owned half the city council. The kid got a slap on the wrist, probation, a hefty fine that was pocket change to them, and some community service at his dad's charity. There was a stink about it at the time, but it was quickly buried. Monroe went on to have his stellar career, and everyone forgot. Almost everyone. The Thorn case. It was the first real lead, the first hint of a secret buried deep in the judge's past. Miller tasked a junior detective with digging up the old case file. Back in the digital lab, Jenkins finally had a breakthrough. She had managed to recover a few corrupted fragments of the wiped file. They were garbled, but a pattern emerged. They were snippets from a bank ledger. Large cash withdrawals. Very large. $100,000. Then another. Then another. All within the last 3 months. All from a private investment account the judge held. The transactions were structured to avoid federal reporting requirements. It was classic blackmail payoff. He wasn't stressed about a federal appointment, Jenkins told Miller, her voice electric with discovery. He was being bled dry. Someone knew his secret, and they were making him pay for it. The two threads, the old case and the new blackmail, were tantalizingly close, but not yet connected. The key was the victim of the Thorn case. Who was the young woman who had died? The junior detective brought Miller the file. It was thick with dust, its pages yellowed and brittle. The defendant, Marcus Thorn. The presiding judge, Alastair Monroe. And the victim, a 21-year-old art student named Lily Penn. Miller stared at the name. Penn. Couldn't be a coincidence. He felt a jolt, the kind a fisherman feels when the line suddenly goes taut. He immediately had Jenkins run a deep background check on their quiet, unassuming court clerk. Arthur Penn, born in the city, had one sibling, an older sister. Lily Penn. Suddenly, the entire landscape of the case shifted, snapping into a new, terrifying focus. Arthur Penn, the meek, helpful clerk, was the brother of the young woman whose death Judge Monroe had, by all appearances, allowed a rich kid to walk away from. His 20 years of quiet, devoted service was not loyalty. It was a vigil. He hadn't just taken a job at the courthouse. He had infiltrated the enemy's fortress. "My God," Jenkins whispered, her eyes wide as she looked at Arthur Penn's employee file on her screen. "He's been here for exactly 20 years. He was hired 6 months after the Thorn verdict. He's been playing a long game, Frank. A very long game." The invisible man suddenly became the most visible person in the room. His quiet demeanor was no longer meekness. It was predatory patience. His encyclopedic knowledge of the courthouse was no longer just professional diligence. It was the meticulous research of a hunter studying his prey. But they still needed to connect him directly to the blackmail and the murder. How did a humble court clerk get the leverage to blackmail a powerful federal judge? The original case file on Marcus Thorn was thin, the evidence presented in court perfunctory. The real proof of judicial misconduct wouldn't be in the official record. It would be buried somewhere else. This thought sent Jenkins down a new path. She started investigating the courthouse's evidence and record storage protocols, both digital and physical. The courthouse had a massive, climate-controlled off-site archive, a veritable city of paper where old case files, evidence logs, and judges' private notes were sent to die. Access was highly restricted. She cross-referenced the access logs for the archive with Arthur Penn's employee ID. For 20 years, he had been a ghost. He never checked anything out. But then, for months ago, his ID popped up. A single request. He had asked for the archived personal case notes of Judge Monroe from his first 2 years on the bench. It was a request so obscure and so mundane that the archive clerk hadn't thought twice about it. "He found it," Miller said, his voice a low growl of realization. Whatever proof there was of Monroe taking a bribe or being coerced, it was in his own notes. Arthur spent 20 years waiting for the system to digitize and forget, and then he just walked into the archives and took it. The picture was now almost complete. Arthur Penn, armed with a 20-year-old secret, begins to blackmail the judge. Not just for money, but likely for something more. Revenge. Justice. The judge, with his federal appointment on the line, begins to pay. But why did it turn to murder? What happened in those chambers? The final piece they needed was the murder weapon. The letter opener had been wiped clean of prints, a classic sign of a planned crime. But the forensics lab had found something else. In the deep, ornate crevices of the handle, they found microscopic fibers. They were too common to be immediately useful, simple wool and cotton fibers, likely from clothing. Miller had an idea. He asked Jenkins to pull the security footage from the main courthouse entrance for the morning of the murder. They watched the river of people, lawyers, clients, staff flowing into the building. And there, at 8:29 a.m., was Arthur Penn. He was wearing his usual drab gray suit. But it was a cold morning, and he was also wearing a simple, dark brown tweed overcoat and a pair of gray cotton gloves. He was wearing gloves when he came into the building, Jenkins noted, before he ever discovered the body. It was damning. It was premeditation. The fibers from the coat and gloves would almost certainly match the ones found on the murder weapon. They now had their suspect. They had the deep personal motive. They had the timeline of his infiltration. They had the evidence of the blackmail. And they had the proof of his premeditation. The ghost who had haunted the courthouse for 2 decades was about to be brought into the light. The question was no longer who had killed the judge or even why. The only question left was what Arthur Penn would say when his 20-year vigil was finally over. The summons for Arthur Penn to come to the precinct for a final clarifying interview was a quiet declaration of war. He arrived at precisely the appointed time, not with a lawyer, but with the same air of weary helpfulness he had projected since the moment he'd made the first call. He sat in the stark, windowless interrogation room, his hands folded neatly on the metal table, the very picture of civic duty. There was no tremor in his hands now, no panic in his eyes. There was only a profound and unnerving stillness, the calm at the absolute center of a hurricane. Detectives Miller and Jenkins sat opposite him. The usual pre-interrogation pleasantries were dispensed with. The game was over and everyone in the room knew it. "We know about your sister, Arthur," Miller began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, devoid of accusation, a simple statement of fact. "We know about Lily." Arthur Penn did not flinch. He did not look surprised. He simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Lily," he said, his voice soft, the first time they had heard it hold any trace of warmth. "She was a wonderful artist. She could find beauty in anything. We also know about the Marcus Thorne case," Jenkins continued, her tone sharp and clinical as she laid a copy of the old case file on the table. "We know Judge Monroe was presiding. We know Thorne walked away with a slap on the wrist after killing your sister." "He didn't walk away," Arthur corrected her gently, his gaze fixed on the file. "A price was paid, just not by him." "You got a job at the courthouse 6 months later," Miller said. "That's a hell of a coincidence." "There are no coincidences in a place like this, Detective," Arthur replied, his eyes finally lifting to meet Miller's. And for the first time, the detectives saw past the meek clerk. They saw a flicker of something ancient and hard, the glint of polished steel. There is only cause and effect, action and consequence. The confession, when it came, was not a breakdown. It was not a torrent of guilt or a plea for understanding. It was a lecture. It was a 20-year dissertation on the nature of justice, delivered with the cold, academic precision of a man who had made it his life's single, obsessive study. The interrogation room became his courtroom, and this was his final, damning testimony. "For 20 years, I watched him," Arthur began, his voice even almost conversational. "I brought him his coffee. I organized his docket. I listened to him deliver eloquent speeches about the sanctity of the law. And every day, I saw the ghost of my sister standing behind him. Every time he put on that black robe, I saw the hypocrisy. That robe wasn't a symbol of justice. It was a shroud he used to bury his sins. He explained his plan with a terrifying, meticulous clarity. He had not studied to become a lawyer. That would have put him in the system's spotlight. He had studied to become a clerk, to become invisible, to become a cog in the great machine so he could learn how it worked from the inside. His goal was not vengeance, not at first. It was truth. I knew Monroe had been bought, Arthur said. A man that ambitious doesn't throw his career away on a youthful mistake. There had to be proof. And I knew a man like him, a man so obsessed with his own legacy, would never be able to fully destroy the evidence of his own corruption. It would be hidden, a trophy of his first big sin. He described how he had spent years, decades, familiarizing himself with the courthouse's labyrinthine archival system. He learned about the forgotten storage rooms in the sub-basement, places where physical records from the pre-digital age were left to rot. And 4 months ago, he had found it. In a box of Judge Monroe's earliest private case notes, tucked into the back of a dusty file, was a ledger. It detailed a series of loans from a construction company owned by Marcus Thorne's father, paid out to a shell corporation that was then traced to a down payment on Monroe's first house. It was the smoking gun. That's when the blackmail began, Jenkins stated. It was not blackmail, detective, Arthur corrected her, a hint of steel in his voice. It was a reckoning. I didn't want his money for myself. I have no need for it. I demanded that he take every spare dollar he had and anonymously fund a new arts wing at the community college Lily had attended. A place for young people like her. He was going to build a monument to the girl whose life he had discarded. And that was it? Miller asked, skeptical. A charitable donation? Arthur Penn smiled. A thin, cold, humorless expression. No, that was merely the penance. The final judgment was yet to come. I gave him an ultimatum. He could either take the proof I had and present it to the Judicial Review Board, confess his crime, and resign in disgrace, saving himself a prison sentence. Or, I would release it to the press the day his federal appointment was announced, creating the biggest judicial scandal in the city's history and destroying him utterly. I gave him a choice, the kind of choice he never gave my sister. He described the final confrontation in the judge's chambers. He had presented the ultimatum. Monroe, the great man of the law, had not been contrite. He had been enraged. He laughed at me, Arthur whispered, his voice finally cracking with a raw, 20-year-old pain. He called me a pathetic little man. He said he had forgotten all about my sister, that she was an insignificant casualty of a world I was too small to understand. He said he would crush me, that he would call the bailiffs and have me arrested for extortion, and that no one would ever believe the word of a nobody clerk over his. And in that moment, looking at his smug, arrogant face, I saw him, not the judge. I saw the man who had sold my sister's life for a house. The man who had let her killer walk free and never lost a night's sleep over it. The rage, suppressed for 2 decades, had erupted in a volcanic surge. He turned his back on me to make the call, Arthur said, his eyes unfocused, reliving the moment. And his letter opener was on the desk, a symbol of his power, his authority. I picked it up, and I passed my own sentence. 1 stab for every year her killer was free. 1 for every year I had to serve him. 1 for every time he put on that robe and blasphemed the very idea of justice. He then described how, his rage spent, his clerk's mind had taken over. The meticulous, orderly part of him had kicked in. He had wiped the prints from the letter opener. He had worn gloves. He had pulled the books from the shelves to suggest a struggle. He had wiped the file from the computer. He had used his knowledge of the maintenance schedule to ensure there was a blind spot. He had committed a crime of pure passion, and then cleaned it up with the cold efficiency of a man who had spent his life managing details. He leaned back in his chair, his confession complete. There was no remorse in his eyes, only a profound sense of finality, of a great and terrible task finally completed. Arthur Penn was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. He never spoke another word in his own defense. The story of the quiet clerk and the corrupt judge became a dark legend in the city, a cautionary tale about the long shadow of injustice. The Marcus Thorne case was reopened, and Thorne, now a portly, middle-aged businessman, was eventually retried and convicted on new evidence Arthur had uncovered, finally sent to prison for the crime he had committed decades earlier. Long after the case was closed, Detective Miller would sometimes find himself thinking about Arthur Penn. He was a murderer, a cold-blooded killer. But in a strange, twisted way, he had delivered a purer, more absolute form of justice than the courthouse had ever been able to provide. He was a monster created by the system itself, a ghost in the archives who had finally emerged to hold the court and its judge in contempt.